Good evening. I want to welcome everyone to our author event series here at Brookline Booksmith, and it's going to be featuring Suzanne Berne and her book, The Blue Window, and it's a conversation with the other author, Elizabeth Graver. Before we hear from these brilliant speakers, we request that you keep your mobile phones on silent during the event. And if you haven't yet picked up your pre-ordered book, or you would like to buy a copy, I will be at the back desk ready to help you at the end of this hour. And also, just so you're aware, we are streaming it live, so as long as you don't want your face on the internet, maybe don't walk in front of the iPad. I want to first thank Elizabeth Graver for moderating this evening. As a local friend here in Boston, she has also authored many novels such as The End of the Point, Awake, The Honeybee, and The Unraveling. It has also had many short works anthologized in Best American Short Stories, Prize Stories, the O. Henry Awards, the Pushcart Prize Anthology, and Best American Essays. As a professor at Boston College, she works with our featured author this evening, and we are so happy to have her lead this discussion. Thank you. Yay! And the author we are so excited to have here tonight is Suzanne Berne. She is our neighbor here in Boston as well, and she teaches creative writing at Boston College and the Rayner Writing Workshop. She has authored many other titles like The Dogs of Littlefield, The Ghost at the Table, The Perfect Arrangement, A Crime in the Neighborhood, and which was a winner of the Great Britain's Orange Prize. She has also had essays appear in Vogue, New York Times Magazine, and The Guardian, plus so many more. But tonight's title is The Blue Window. It is a riveting novel about a therapist on an explorative journey through the understanding of generations of family. And I'm excited for this conversation, and we're so happy to have you here. So without further ado, our featured author. Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much, and it's so lovely to be here at Brookline Booksmith, which has been part of my life for a long time. And I realized when I looked it up today, Brookline Booksmith was founded the year I was born, so I feel particularly attached to it. And thank you so much, Elizabeth. It's so wonderful to be here with you. I really appreciate this, and thank you everybody for coming. So I'm gonna read a little bit from my novel, The Blue Window, and I'll just set it up for a minute first. It's about three characters who are closely related and yet very estranged, who wind up spending 3 days together in a very small and uncomfortable cottage in northern Vermont on Lake Champlain. They're each hiding something from themselves as well as from each other. And the secrets are a big part of this book, but I would say a bigger part is the hiding and what hiding does to people, especially when they've been hiding something significant for a long time. The kinds of evasions and refusals and contortions that people find themselves locked into when they've determined not to talk about something. And one of the quotes that I've always kept with me and certainly had with me while I was working on this book is from Chekhov's A Lady with a Pet Dog, in which he says, "The personal life of every individual is based on secrecy," which is an idea that I have always found fascinating, haunting, and oddly companionable. Because if you think about it and you agree with him, it means that we're all of us always surrounded by secrets, which is very true of the characters in my book. And in their case, the secrets are coming to a head, coming to a breaking point during these 3 days they spend together, mostly because they are stuck together. Those characters are an elderly Dutch woman named Marika, who was in the Dutch resistance as a teenager. Her daughter Lorna, who is divorced and she's a clinical social worker who lives outside of Boston. And Lorna's son Adam, who is 19 years old and is just home from his freshman year of college and is very unhappy and won't tell his mother why. And no matter what therapeutic techniques she tries on him, they don't work. And I'm going to start by reading a little bit from the first chapter, which is from Adam's point of view. Something happened to him during the last week of his first year of college that has sent him into hiding into his room. It's also made him decide to stop using the first person and to refer to himself instead by a letter. You could assume A stood for Adam. That's what the mother assumed if she found a note in the kitchen that said something like, "Going out, A." also assume A stood for the first letter of the alphabet, or A for anonymous. Or, if you chose to get philosophical, you could posit that A meant against, and that A was making a political statement by becoming A. If you were into physics, A might stand for something extra negative, like A for antimatter. Or, if you had been on campus 3 weeks ago, A probably stood for asshole. Whatever it meant, A was not I. That was the point. A did away with I. I equals death. You might assume the above statement was related to what happened during finals on the lawn in front of the college library, but A would suggest obvious causal reasoning was as bad as complicated causal reasoning. Neither proved anything. Plus, explanations turn into excuses. Though, if A were ever called upon to argue the case for rejecting I while testifying before the Student Judiciary Council or, say, Congress, this might be A's response. Erasing the first person is the only responsible moral position to take in a world full of moral positions, most of them absurd and all of them dangerous. To wit, the enraged Twitter lava flow accompanying news coverage of any march, speech, parade, Sunday school Easter egg hunt. Thus, it is profoundly unsafe to attach to anything, to identify as anything. Ergo, show no concern, have no opinion. The world is full of fake news, so don't make any. Hence, eliminate I, the raised hand, the flag of existence. Solution, A equals absent. Actually, it had been easier than expected to shed the first person pronoun and most possessive word forms once A discovered that anything could be said in the passive voice. For instance, when the mother asked if A had walked Freddie while she was at work, A could answer, "It seems so," or "It seems not." If she said, "What have you been doing all day?" A might say, "Naps occurred," or "Videos were watched." Added value of the passive voice, no definitely positive or negative statements, although sometimes affirmation was necessary, like when the mother said, "Should I buy more avocados when I go to the grocery?" For those occasions, A used perchance, a word so affected it could only mean yes. This afternoon, when the mother arrived home from her office and opened the bedroom door to begin her usual interrogation, A reported lunch had been eaten, the trash had not been taken out, Freddie had not been walked, job applications to Starbucks and Wegmans had yet to be emailed. "Bad choices were made," she said, and came into the room to sit on the edge of the bed. She looked at t-shirts, dirty underwear on the floor, sighed, and said she'd had a long day. Said she was looking forward to a quiet evening, to having a glass of wine. Maybe after dinner the two of them could watch something. How about an old movie? There was a stealthy drift of her lemony perfume as she leaned forward and reached for A's hand, which A slid under the sheet before she could reach it. "Sorry if I'm being intrusive, sweetheart." She sat back, still smiling, though her eyes looked unsteady. "But I miss talking with you." These types of assaults were increasing and growing more cunning. Fatigue setting in. Every morning the same routine. Wait for the mother to leave for work, then cereal in bed, videos, lunch in bed, videos, followed by her return and the afternoon offensive. "Going for a walk, wanna come?" A short reprieve and then more attacks, like the one tonight at dinner. "So I've got some ideas of what might be fun for us to do together." Until Windows finally went black. Exile, the only remedy. Meanwhile, until such plan could be formed, filial relationship must be abbreviated further. Ditto with the father. Designate by glyphs, math coordinates, chromosomal contribution. Yes, the ultimate reduction. X equals mother, Y equals father. For other human associates, use first initials, except one, for whom there could be no letter, no referent, only a blank, a gap, the nausea of nothing. Time to abbreviate even thought. Later that night, while padding barefoot down the upstairs hall on the way to take a leak, A was halted by the unmistakable sounds of being under discussion. Let's not pressure him. X was talking to Y in her bedroom on speakerphone. He's going through something. You keep saying that, Lorna. Y's speaker voice was both remote and too loud, like someone calling from a space module. He's been home since the end of May. Y himself was back in Seattle after 2 weeks in Japan, spent at a medical conference in Tokyo, and then sightseeing with his research assistant / girlfriend, Angelica. I've tried calling and texting. I never hear anything. What's he do all day? I don't know what's going on, X said, lowering her voice so that A had to lean against the door panel. But he seems incredibly unhappy. I suggested going back to Dr. Melman, but he refuses to see anybody. We've been through this kind of thing before, said Y. Remember when those kids quit his band? A grimaced, but stayed pressed against the door. This is different, said X. He doesn't even sound like himself. How do you mean? Almost like he's not the one speaking. I could try to find him some kind of internship out here. Y sounded doubtful. If I can barely get him out of his room for dinner, Roger, I don't think I can get him on a plane. Maybe you could come for a visit. A brief exchange concerning logistics, flights, car rentals, the difficulties Y faced taking time off from the lab. A stopped listening and began contemplating a foray to the kitchen for a banana. Self-erasure required constant scourges, hence yesterday's decision to become vegan. Hunger, however, now constant. Good. Hunger focuses the mind. When one is starving, all other thoughts seem immaterial. Conversation shift. X now reporting a phone call from someone, a Vermont neighbor of her mother's. Apparently she'd tried to rehang a bird feeder blown down from a tree branch and had fallen off a ladder. Possible sprained ankle. Questions from Y. Doctor consulted? Have you spoken with her? X. Won't answer the phone. You know how she is. New problem. Grandmother. How to designate. From 44 autosomal chromosomes, what contribution from her? What region of genome? On the other side of the door, the conversation had shifted once again. Y was speaking. Is it a girlfriend, you think? A's head filled with static at leaf blower volume, barely clearing in time to hear X say she didn't know. Any sign he's had a girlfriend? Not that I know of. Do you think he could be gay? Y was proceeding in his usual systematic way. When did your brother decide he was gay? He didn't decide he was gay, said X. Anyway, I don't think that's it. A stepped back from the door, but continued to hover in the hallway, face itching, slightly frightened by such parental ignorance and bafflement. I think he's depressed, X said. Depressed? Like depressed? Well, not clinically. I'd say it's situational, but something's wrong. The other day, when we were driving home from the dermatologist, I asked if he wanted to stop somewhere for lunch. He didn't answer, so I said, "Do you care about stopping or not?" And he said he didn't care about anything. Kids his age always say stuff like that, interrupted Y. What? So I tried to make a joke of it. I said, "Not even onion rings?" And he said, "The only way to live in this crap world is to care about nothing." Silence. Roger, I'm worried something happened at school, something he feels he can't talk about. Maybe he needs a job and a girlfriend, said Y. That's what he needs. So I'm going to read a short section from the next chapter. Adam's father suggests to Lorna, his mother, to try to get Adam to go to Vermont with her to check on his grandmother, to see if she's sprained her ankle and to see if she's okay. Lorna does, and she's amazed when Adam actually agrees to go along. For Adam, a trip to Vermont with his mother is another scourge, another way to erase himself by doing something that's exactly the opposite of anything he would like to do. For Lorna, it's a chance to try to talk with Adam and figure out what it is that's going on. In this next scene, it's the next morning. Lorna is getting ready for the car ride ahead, and there's something that she wants to tell Adam that she's never told him before, something about his grandmother, which partly explains her very strange relationship with her mother and why they only see Marika once a year for less than 24 hours at Thanksgiving. The water went suddenly cold as Lorna was rinsing shampoo out of her hair. Adam must have flushed the toilet. At least he was awake, although probably he'd done nothing about packing. While she dried her hair, she thought about what to say in the car on the way to Vermont. Adam, I can tell you're upset about something. Adam, whatever it is that's making you unhappy, even if you think it's the worst thing in the world, I'm here to tell you it won't last. Believe me, I have been there. Adam, are you listening? Most likely he would find the timing suspicious. He'd think that by revealing something unfortunate about herself, she was hoping he'd talk about whatever had happened to him, which was the truth. He might get angry, he might feel sorry for her, probably he'd demand to know why she hadn't told him before. Did you just forget that your mother deserted you? The old Adam, anyway, might say something sarcastic like that. No, I didn't forget, but there are things you can decide not to think about. Disappearance, not desertion, was how Lorna had thought of it as a child. One day Marika was there, the next she had vanished, leaving behind a strangeness so profound that for several days no one spoke of it. She was simply gone. No place laid for her at breakfast, no sound of her voice on the stairs, no smell of her cigarettes or lipstick prints on coffee cups. The third night, Lorna and her brother Wade were called into the den after dinner, and their father told them to sit down on the old plaid sofa between his bookcases. He sat in his matching plaid chair by the fireplace and lit his pipe, making his usual show of puffing to get it going, holding the match flame above the pipe's bowl. Well, he said finally, pulling on his pipe. He puffed out a cloud of sweet tobacco smoke. Your mother might be gone for a while. Pinkish summer twilight pressed against the window screens. Beside her on the sofa, Wade picked at a scab on his lower lip. The fact is, their father added mildly, puffing out another fragrant blue cloud, don't think she'll be back. That was all the information ever offered. Water under the bridge, their grandmother might say, if the subject came up. Lorna leaned toward the indistinct face in the steamy bathroom mirror. Another reason she had kept this story mostly to herself was that it was so hard to explain. Usually people can account for their life-altering events. And it wasn't that she'd kept Marika's disappearance a secret from Adam, so much as waited for the right time to tell him. That was also the truth. If he accused her of keeping secrets, she could remind him of his childhood separation anxieties. Night after night, he'd made her promise to still be alive when he woke up. She was almost 40 when he was born. Her age relative to his friend's parents may have been worrying. In any case, stories about vanishing mothers would have frightened him, and he'd never seemed curious about his grandmother, aside from the story Lorna told him of Marika's experience during the war, about which he wanted to know much more than Lorna could tell him. Also, children take parental deprivation to heart, and she hadn't wanted him to feel guilty for having a mother when she hadn't had one. Then, after Roger moved to Seattle, she hadn't wanted to raise the specter of abandonment. On the other hand, if she told Adam years ago about Marika's disappearance, he would have found it disturbing, but he would have let her reassure him, and gradually that story would have become simply a story. Now, because it had been withheld, it would be invested with too much significance, seen to be essential as explaining everything, especially her attachment to him, her willingness to drop whatever she was doing the moment he called her, her habit of taking him too seriously, as he liked to complain. So I'm going to read one last very short section. It's a little bit later in the novel. Lorna and Adam have arrived in Vermont with Freddie the dog, and they have spent an uncomfortable afternoon and evening with an unwelcoming Marika, but they have managed to have dinner together, which went reasonably well, after which Adam and Lorna leave for the motel where they are supposed to be spending the night, only to find that the motel does not accept dogs. And Freddie has been having stomach trouble all day long. So Lorna calls Marika from the parking lot to ask if Freddie the dog can stay with Marika, and she says he can only stay outside. And at that point, Adam volunteers to sleep at his grandmother's house. And in this scene, Lorna has just dropped him off and driven away, leaving Adam and his grandmother alone together for the first time ever. And the only other thing I'll say is Adam has decided to designate his grandmother as G. It had seemed like another convenient scourge to volunteer to sleep on the sofa here instead of at the motel, where, but for Freddie, would have had to bunk with X. But now, major misgivings, bordering on freak out. The room was stuffy, chicken from dinner still hanging in the air, along with a strange smell, reminiscent of AP Bio labs during the weeks spent on frog dissection, a smell that might be coming from G. Sit, she repeated. Clutching her stick, she sank into her armchair. With both hands on the armrests, she looked kind of like Abraham Lincoln in a nightgown, seated in the Lincoln Memorial. Similar gaunt heaviness, big cheekbones, too much forehead, stony penitential set to the mouth. No trace of the beauty X claimed she'd once had, except maybe for her eyes, an unusual light blue behind the smudgy lenses of her glasses. Try not to look at her nightgown, or imagine primordial breasts underneath. Do you want something? She said. On the crate next to her stood a bottle and 2 glasses. Cognac or some other thing? Taken aback by this offer, said, Cognac would be an okay ting, accidentally echoing her slightly mechanical accent. But her face remained expressionless as she poured amber liquid into one of the glasses and handed it over. Hope cognac tastes more or less like beer. G lifted her glass and muttered something that sounded like Proust. Cognac lit up throat, resulting in a brief, hard coughing fit. G drained her glass. So, she said, pouring herself more cognac, what shall we talk about? Talk. Somehow had not foreseen. New scourge, already woozy from the cognac, uttered the first thing that came to mind. You don't have a TV. She gave a snort. Don't have time for that foolishness. Or a dishwasher, approvingly. You have a very small carbon footprint. She made no response, and they sat staring mutely at the picture window. The lamplight made their reflections look ghostly in the dark glass, but also strangely similar. Minutes passed. Decades. Finally, unable to think of anything else, mumbled, so, was wondering about your, life? She didn't move, and her eyes were half closed, but a muscle contracted at the corner of her mouth. Like what you did in the war? Still nothing. Maybe she'd fallen asleep. Some animals never fully close their eyes, always alert to predators. Or maybe some animals didn't have eyelids? Possibly snakes did not have eyelids. Tried to recall whether the frog dissected in AP Bio had eyelids. Must have been really scary. Almost immediately, G frowned. But instead of ignoring this moronic comment, as she did whenever anyone spoke to her at Thanksgiving, she looked into her glass and said, we all had our facts. In the kitchen, the old refrigerator hummed. There was a scraping sound from somewhere, like fingernails against a wall. What do you mean by facts? She leaned back in her chair, long veiny hands folded on her belly. The lamplight was now strong on one side of her face, leaving the other in shadow. You did what you did, she said, widening one blue eye. Then she said, why do you care about all this old stuff? Everyone cares. Like practically every movie was about it. Where you live, maybe, she said. Most people don't think of it. That's not true, although it could be true. Anyway, what did she mean by where you live? Because Y was Jewish? Was she being anti-Semitic or just random? Despite feeling queasy, A took another sip of cognac. Anyway, maybe people care because they still don't understand it. This idea seemed possibly intelligent. Like people know what happened, but they still don't get why, so they can't let it go. She lifted one foot and gave a kind of grimace. Outside on the deck, Freddie gave a short whine. The lamp by her armchair had begun flickering again. So, she said, with either a burp or a grunt, what about you? Me? Almost said, instead shrugged. You tell me a fact. Fact? You want a fact? After a pause that hopefully seemed thoughtful, decided to switch to French, where the impersonal could rescue one more naturally from oneself. On ne comprend pas. Rather than looking more annoyed, for the first time that evening she smiled. I forgot you speak French. Un peu. Another dry smile. To be a citizen of the world, she declared, a person must speak more than one language. She herself spoke 4. A flare of ancient vanity ignited her face. Your mother is not good at languages. C'est vrai. X couldn't sing on key either. Together, they sipped their cognac in the unsteady light, fellow citizens of the world. Then G said, what are your facts? Face heated up and started to itch. No facts. A long look from G. No facts, eh? Here it was again. The lawn by the college library, shouts, sobs, face pressed into the grass, the perpetual throat ache. But after a moment of staring fixedly at the dark window, realized with a kind of amazement that for once something else was creating that throat ache. It was G. In that shabby old armchair and smelly nightgown, all alone, night after night, a woman who had looked upon death, destruction, madness, and refused to talk about it. Who knew you couldn't understand if you hadn't been there, that even if you had been there, it couldn't be described, because to describe it would be to accept it. Who knew that people were full of ugly facts and, unlike X, didn't believe in explanations and excuses. You did what you did. End of story. What a fucking relief. Thank you.
Great reading. Okay, let's just get ourselves set up. Are we both going to be?
Yes, or I can stand. Would that be easier?
I don't know. I could stand.
We could both stand.
Should
We
we
could do a little dance.
Okay. Is that good? So can you all hear?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay. Thank you, Suzanne. This is such a pleasure. We've known each other forever, and I've been such a fan of you and your writing, and I really, really love this book. The mix that you do here of kind of revealing and holding back, and the kind of triptych, but where people are sort of half meeting but never quite seeing each other, although slowly that changes, I think is pretty extraordinary. And I love the humor, especially with A. So I have a few questions, and then we also wanted to leave lots of time for you all to ask questions, but we'll just start with a bit of a conversation. So my first question is, I think kind of embodied in, is that too loud?
A little bit too
loud?
just press a little further front of my phone.
Back up.
That's good.
It's hard to look at you and you. I'm just going to look at you. So my first question, I think, is embodied in a lot of what you just read. But both Adam and Marika, his grandmother, are fleeing the past. And I was incredibly interested, and you can see it in these early passages, by how their use of language or their lack of language helps them manage their emotions. So Adam, as we saw, won't use first person or refer to himself, and has this very both comical and wrenching way of referring to the various people in his life by sort of reducing them and almost making them scientific, like chemicals. And Lorna, who's originally, as we see, from Holland, this is not, much of this isn't in what you read, but marries an American man who's hearing impaired, so can't hear much of what she says, and she makes a life for herself in a different language. At one point she says, too much jibber jabber, which is a great phrase. So I'm wondering if you can talk about language in this book, both its role for the characters and also as a writer, what your decision to play with their relationships with it did stylistically, because to me that was one of the huge pleasures of the differences between the different sections. So kind of two-part question. One, what is their relationship? How is language related to inner life and their past? And two, what was it like to write them in this way?
Well, that is a great question. I think when you're going to have multiple points of view in a novel, one of the challenges is how do you make them sound different and seem different. So that was certainly something I was thinking about, but it seemed natural, partly generationally, that they would sound different, and I thought Marika is someone who spends most of her time alone and has basically lost all emotional language. She doesn't talk about herself. She tries very hard not to think about her past, and her language for me started to make the most sense as stripped down to basic needs. She talks a lot about food, and she talks about her bodily functions, and it's hard to get her to move off of that, and I thought of it as a defensive place to be. That is where she feels comfortable talking, and that is what she mostly focuses on. And then Adam is just determined to, on the one hand, be honorable and accept that he is guilty of something. You don't find out for a long time what it is. At the same time, he doesn't want to talk about it. And he's in a terrible position with his mother, who is a clinical social worker who wants to try to get him to talk. And the paradox for him is just exactly the person who should be able to help him. He can't bear to have help him. He doesn't want to talk. And so he has to somehow limit himself, his thinking, and even the way that he communicates. And in between that is Lorna, who talks all the time and also analyzes everyone and has a diagnosis for everyone. And knowing that I had those three different ways of sort of, and she's of course hiding something too, and analyzing everyone else and not herself, I thought having those ways of communicating and not communicating were a way to help me get deeper into what each character was going to have to eventually face and how. And it kept it from also being, I think there's a lot of trauma narratives out in the world right now, and I thought of this as a different kind of story. It was the narrative of not being able, or not wanting to, or not knowing how to say what it is that you feel has traumatized you. And I think that's also a narrative with trauma, is not being able to talk about it. And so I had to figure out how to create a way for them all not to talk about what was going on and still have something to say. So that was kind of that ended up being a challenge.
Thank you. It's interesting. I hadn't made this connection until I just heard you read, but it's interesting that she says to him, I speak 4 languages. To be a citizen of the world, you need more language. And then they revert back into their weird silence. You know? It's so great, their interactions.
It's aspirational.
Well, and she does at various points, I don't want to give things away, but there are some really interesting moments as the book goes on where her language sort of slips, and either Dutch comes in or she sort of says things that she doesn't mean to, and it seems partly because she's aging, but partly because walls are coming down in various ways. So the kind of collapse of language and for certain characters, and then also the relaxing of boundaries in a good way as things progress, I thought was really interesting. Like there's a strand for each of them where you can kind of follow it, and it's so delicate and beautiful.
Thank you.
Should I ask you another question?
Sure.
Okay, this one connects to the beautiful cover and the title. And I was struck reading The Blue Window about how full of lush descriptions of nature and how full of architectural imagery it is. It has lots of doors, passageways, bridges, this picture window that she sits in front of, and you saw that beautiful moment that you read aloud where it's nighttime, so rather than seeing out, they see their own reflections and they notice a kind of again, very delicately delivered, but similarity between the two of them reflected in the window. And as I was reading, I almost had the feeling that space and place were a kind of other character, or doing again very quiet work to help us both see the characters and also provide instances of both kind of entrapment and crossing over and opening. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, maybe starting with this blue window. Was it the title you first came up with? Maybe you could describe a little the sort of work it's doing, but I'm curious about, the book is also filled with beautiful nature descriptions, but kind of place as connected to these traumatized bodies in different ways, and also traumatized minds.
Well, I usually start thinking of a place first when I'm beginning a book, and friends of mine have a house that's on an island in Lake Winnipesaukee that is just this tiny little house perched on a rock, and it's got this enormous window, and I've always loved going there. It's just this huge window, and it's full of the lake. And I thought when I was working, I wanted to set something in that house because it's just remained such an interesting place for me. But it itself is such an odd transitional space, and I was thinking of all the places in this book are places people are passing through, or they should be passing through, but they've gotten stuck there and stay there instead. Marika's house is a summer cottage that she lives in all year, and it's barely habitable. She's almost not furnished it. And there are lots of moments where people are sort of stuck looking at the window. Are they looking out? Are they looking in? And with her, the other image that really stayed with me the whole time I was working on this book is I had an elderly neighbor who died this past year who spent most of her life sitting at her window watching the street. And it was her way of being part of the world, but it was not clear always what she was looking at. And I sometimes thought she was looking at all the things that had not happened to her. And I think with Marika, she is such a shut down person, but she has this enormous view, this huge view, but she herself doesn't seem to be able to have any kind of corresponding space in her life. So I thought about that a lot with these characters, with people walking in and out of small rooms, being stuck in a car together. They have this big, beautiful world outside that they can't seem to really get into or notice. And it just intensified the problems that they were having of being able to get out of this place where they were hiding something and couldn't figure out who to tell or how to tell, to find the language for it. And the place itself, I think, is exacerbating their problems. It's so open and they're so closed up.
So not soothing her at all? Because she loves birds. I somehow took it as slightly more positive.
Well, she's hiding there, and it is a beautiful place to hide, but it's pretty remote. Most of the time, nobody else lives there. And I think she takes care of what she can take care of, which are she has a bird feeder. I think she's hiding out. I thought of her as kind of a spy in a way, where she didn't belong to the country she lived in, but she couldn't go back to the place she was from. So she's in this kind of stuck place looking out at a life that she doesn't have a way of joining. And then arrives her daughter, who she hardly knows, and her grandson, who she really doesn't know. And all of a sudden, from living alone, she has this overpopulated small house. And I think that, of course, does antagonize anyone and to start saying things that they didn't mean to say.
And the title, did it come to you early?
Well, the window was always a big part of it. And I'm terrible with titles, and I had all kinds of different titles at different times. But I do love Matisse's painting, The Blue Window, and I've always had a postcard of it. And some of the elements in the painting are in the book too. There's a woman's head, there's a window, there's trees, but the other thing that I loved about that painting was something I'd read about Matisse, where that he always used a plumb line. In any of his painting, there was always a plumb line that went vertical, where he sort of based everything around it. And I kept thinking about that in terms of a window having these kinds of panes up and down, that even as these people are, feeling trapped, they're also, hanging on to something. They're hanging on to a way of being that, at least for now, has made sense to them and allowed them to get through whatever they're getting through.
That's a great association. Hadn't thought of it. Okay, the next question is about Chip,
Oh, God.
her dog. Not quite, but so we all know you love dogs. Anyone who's read The Dogs of Littlefield knows that dogs are central to it, and some of us have actually had the pleasure of meeting your giant, beautiful old pup, Chip. So I was interested in this book we have Freddie, the dog, and we also have moths, we have raccoons, we have birds, we have Adam thinking about snakes and whether they sleep. And again, I was somewhat in the same way as I was thinking about some of the architectural or built images. It was interesting to me in a book so filled with wounded and often non-speaking or sort of averting people, the role that animals have. So I was interested in Freddie, and I was also interested, there's some very beautiful moments in the book where it kind of breaks with realism, and suddenly Marika has birds. I think it was breaking with realism. You never know. It was a rundown house, but lots of birds flying through the room. And I'm wondering if you could talk, there's a lot of animals in here, about Freddie or the birds or the moths.
Well, I tried to make it a very animated book. You know, if you have people who are not talking, you have to have something going on. So, the world around them, I felt was almost hyper animated, or that's one of the things that I was trying to have working against some of the silence between the people. And also, I think if you do go up to a place like northern Vermont, it's not quiet. You think it's going to be quiet, but it's actually pretty loud. There's all sorts of insects, there's all sorts of strange noises in the trees. You hear things out on the lake, especially with a big lake, sound really carries. And I think that the silence is not ever silence. And that was one way that I tried to make it clear that all the things that they're not saying are really loud. And so is this supposedly peaceful, lovely place in northern Vermont where they're spending time. And so I think the animals in a way are, it's part of the energy that gets ratcheted up almost to the breaking point, you know, while these people are attempting not to deal with each other and deal with each other at the same time.
There was a moment that I was trying to find that I just loved, but I probably won't be able to find it, where they go outside and there's all these they feel all these little eyes watching them. And it was one of those, again, very subtle moments, but of a sense of, yes, there's a bunch of little beasts out in the bush, but there's also the past and each other and a constant sense of kind of hypervigilance and scrutiny, but also I thought beauty. I mean, I found her feeding of the birds to be quite moving, that she would bother, you know, in the midst of such a pared down and kind of lonely and kind of reduced life, that was something she did. And then you build in this whole plot around the bird feeder too, and her so-called sprained ankle. I won't give it away. But, should I ask, I'm trying to keep a little track of time, maybe, well, it's 7:44.
Should we go ahead and see?
Should we go ahead and see? I have a couple more, but I'm sure other people have lots of great questions.
Bernie.
So I know you a little bit, so this is a question I have, like, in general about, like, writers. It probably depends on the writer, but, like, so Lorna, the character of Lorna, is a middle-aged woman who's worrying about her young adult children, which is obviously something that you can personally relate to, like, that's a part of your life. And then Adam is this, like, kind of shut down 19-year-old boy, and I'm wondering, is it easier or harder to write about a character that's more like who you are and where you are in your life? Or is it easier or harder to write about somebody who's in, like Adam, who's in a totally different, like, he couldn't be more different than you are in the phase of life you're in, like, which is...
Yes, the phase of life that I'm
I was trying to be nice.
You know, Adam was the easiest character for me. It partly, I have had many 19-year-old college students, so he was a familiar person in some ways, but it was also because his life was so different, and he was really a pleasure to write. As much as he's badly behaved in the novel, he was a pleasure to work with. And Marika was also an easier character. The character who was really difficult was Lorna. And in some ways I think of, if I thought of these characters as stained glass, I think Adam and Marika are these highly colored pieces of glass. I mean, they're just so odd. And Lorna is kind of supposed to be the clear pane. And she was extremely difficult to understand and figure out, and what it was that was driving her and why she couldn't communicate despite being a clinical social worker with these two people, why they were uniting against her and in many ways. That took me a really long time, but I realized that this novel would in no way have worked without her, because the two of them would have become tiresome if they had just stayed in their little locked places that they were comfortable in together. It took her to be the antagonist, really, to open things up. And it was interesting. I'm not used to thinking of somebody who is thoughtful and kind and gracious as an antagonist, but that is what she is. So it did take a long time. Thank you for that question.
That was my last question too.
Oh, thank you.
Some version of it.
Lynn.
Hi, Suzanne. I loved what you read. It was really funny. It strikes me your writing is funny. I always laugh. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the role of humor in your fiction, because this is kind of, seemingly a dark topic, trauma and, intergenerational, just kind of like sadness and loss. So, like, how do you weave? I mean, you're funny. You always make me laugh. But how do you weave that in so that it works?
That is such an interesting question. I think I can't take anything seriously unless I can also make it into something that's humorous. It just seems to me that the two things are always wedded, especially if you're trying to think about how to return something to its proper proportion. And with people who've, in this case, been hiding things, everything gets magnified the more you conceal it and the more you try to keep it down. And humor always seems to be one of the ways to return things to their right proportion. And there's something clear-eyed about humor. There's something sort of frank and honest about it that I think, especially if you're dealing with characters who are distorting lots of things, it seems like you have to treat them that way. I think if I had tried to write this book as absolutely earnest all the way through, I would have become repelled by it myself. So it's a way of keeping me interested in them. It's a way of keeping me, I feel, honest about what I'm trying to do. It's also a way to continue to shift the angles that I'm looking at something from. To have one character look at something absolutely deadly serious and have another character dismiss it, for instance. I think that moving things around in that way also creates humor. Changing, the things that people take really seriously can be very small, and the things that they ignore are the enormous things. I think that's the basis of a lot of humor too, and that makes sense to me. I think that is often how I approach things. I obsess over the tiny things and ignore the giant ones. Anyway, thank you for that question.
Thank you.
Yes, Ms. Garcia.
I always think of you as a writer who really has a strong sense of community. Your characters, it's not just the characters for just a couple, but you have the dog, right? The student government or the schools or the whatever, and all this interaction. And the sections you read, I haven't had the pleasure of reading the book yet, but the section that you read tonight suggested that this might be more of a chamber piece, just a few characters, and I wondered if that was influenced by COVID, or if you're already working on it, if you thought that was already underway, that you find yourself drawing smaller, or I don't know what I'm talking about because I haven't read it yet.
No, I think that's a really interesting question. I started this novel quite a bit before the pandemic, but I was writing it during the pandemic, and I decided during the pandemic to set it right before. So it takes place in the summer of 2019, which I think affects the reading of it, because we know what's headed the way of these isolated characters, but they don't yet. But I think, yes, all of that being closed in and what that means, how hard it is after you've been isolated to move back out again. I think all of that ended up, that experience of the pandemic ended up affecting this book, although I had started it beforehand. Weirdly, long before the pandemic, Lorna's ex-husband Roger, I had made an epidemiologist. So that was odd, and I certainly made use of that. But I think the isolating aspects of social media were also on my mind, especially having a character like Adam who's on his laptop all the time and is terrified of what he's going to see about himself on there. I think he's certainly hiding out from a larger consciousness of him, and I think that's a reality for a lot of people, of getting sort of stuck in this smaller and smaller and smaller world. And we all saw it, unfortunately, on Zoom, where everyone was in this little box, and everyone started to look middle-aged. Even young children on Zoom seem to look like they're about 50. So it was doing something to everybody, and certainly I know it did affect this book too. So anyway, thank you for that question.
I just can't bear the thought of Adam starting to do a little better and then the pandemic happens. It's after the end of the book, but
Oh God.
can't go back to school.
Yes.
Did you find that before you wrote it, you had an idea of what was going to happen throughout, or as you were writing it, things changed for the characters that you were surprised about?
I mean, this book took many, many drafts, and I thought I knew what I was doing in the first draft, and 37 drafts later, I still thought I knew what I was doing. One of the things that this came up actually in the reading I just gave on Sunday, somebody said, "Do you remember what the first part of this book was?" And I had forgotten that I started this book years ago with the character of Lorna getting a phone call from police up in Vermont saying, "Your mother has gone missing. You need to come up here and deal with the fact that your mother has gone missing." And I wrote a whole draft. I may have written 2 drafts with that, only to realize that it was a much more interesting story if the missing person was right in front of her. So that's a small example of how radically things changed, and often because they became more literal, weirdly enough. If something that started as more of an abstract idea in my mind became more and more deeply literal, the real problem of dealing with someone who will not relate to you right in front of you, who might as well not be there. But I know there are people who plot things out from the very beginning, and I envy them. I have never been able to do that.
Thank you.
Well, thank you all so much. I brought Prosecco, and there's cookies and chocolate, and I'm hoping that people will stick around. Will you stick around?
I will stick around. And will you sign some books?
Yes, I would love to do that. Thank you so much for coming this
Thank you.
evening.